Have you ever sat in a place where you paid for dignity, but were treated as if you didn't belong? Imagine stepping onto a plane, ticket in hand, seat reserved. Yet when the meal arrives, you're given nothing more than a piece of bread and a glass of water, while others around you are served with respect. What would you do in that moment? Would you raise your voice, risk being painted as angry, or would you stay silent, carrying the insult like a weight? Now imagine if the person in that seat wasn't just any passenger, but a black CEO whose company monitored the very skies he was flying through. One choice could turn a quiet humiliation into a storm that shook an entire industry. And here's the question for you, if it had been you. Sitting there, would you have the courage to stay calm, or the patience to let justice speak louder than rage? This is not just a story about a meal. It's about respect, power, and the systems that decide who is seen and who is invisible. Stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe, because this is a story you won't forget. The loudspeaker crackled through the terminal at Denver International Airport. Now boarding first-class passengers for flight UA 4228 service to New York City. Marcus Ellington rose slowly from the leather chair in the lounge. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a navy suit that carried the quiet weight of success. The cut of the jacket was impeccable. The polished shoes told their own story. On his wrist, a silver watch ticked with quiet precision. To any stranger, he looked like another accomplished traveler making his way east for business. But to Marcus, every step toward the gate felt heavier than the last. As he approached, the gate agent barely glanced at his boarding pass before holding it in her hand longer than necessary. Her smile faded, replaced by the kind of suspicion Marcus had known since childhood. "Sir, this is for first class," she said, voice dipped with a politeness too thin to hide the doubt. Marcus didn't flinch. "Yes," he answered simply, his tone calm, as if he had explained this countless times before. The scanner beeped green. Still. She looked him up and down before handing the pass back with hesitation. "Enjoy your flight," she muttered. The line behind him shuffled impatiently. A man in a gray blazer sighed loudly and muttered under his breath. Probably upgraded. Marcus caught it. He always caught it. He tucked the pass into his jacket pocket, straightened his shoulders, and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, the glow of first class shimmered with promise. Wide leather seats, ambient lighting, champagne flutes catching the light from overhead bins. A small orchestra of wealth and privilege seemed to play silently in the air. "Welcome aboard." A flight attendant greeted a couple stepping in before him. Her voice was bright, warm, dripping with charm. She took the woman's coat, offered her a glass of wine before she had even sat down. When Marcus stepped forward, her smile faltered. The warmth cooled. "Are you sure this is your seat?" "Sir," she asked, glancing down at the ticket in his hand as though it were a counterfeit bill. "2A," Marcus replied evenly, sliding into the seat with a controlled grace. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. The attendant gave a stiff nod and walked away, her heels clicking like punctuation marks in the silence she left behind. Marcus placed his carry-on under the seat, adjusting his tie. Around him, the other passengers settled into their luxury. A man 2 rows over chuckled with the flight attendant about golf. Another asked for bourbon neat, which arrived almost before he finished the request. For Marcus, there was nothing but the thin glass of water placed on his tray table, condensation dripping slowly like time itself. He looked out the window, Denver fading into a backdrop of mountains, and breathed. He had learned long ago not to react to the first sting. Sometimes the sting was a test. Sometimes it was the beginning of something larger. The boarding continued. A young mother with a toddler was guided gently to her seat, bags lifted for her without asking. A man in a tailored suit received an offer of champagne. The world seemed to bend for everyone but him. Marcus sat still, but inside, the old weight pressed against his chest. It wasn't about the champagne, or the bourbon, or even the smile withheld. It was the memory those moments always stirred. He remembered being 12 years old, sitting in a diner with his mother in Alabama. She had asked for a slice of pie. The waitress looked at her, then at Marcus, then said coldly, "We're out." 10 minutes later, she brought the same pie to a white couple across the aisle. His mother had smiled, patted Marcus on the hand, and whispered, "Baby, don't you ever think it's about you? It's about them." But Marcus had felt the cut anyway, and decades later, in a first-class seat he had paid for without blinking, the cut bled fresh. The announcement over the intercom pulled him back to the present. "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff." Marcus shifted in his seat, inhaled deeply, and let the air settle in his lungs. He was not the boy in Alabama anymore. He was Marcus Ellington. He was the founder and CEO of AeroWatch Technologies, the very company that monitored the skies for the airline he was flying on. And yet, here he sat, a man diminished to a question mark in the eyes of a flight attendant. He rested his hand on the armrest, fingers tapping slowly. He would not raise his voice. He would not demand attention. He knew better than most. The strongest voice was often the one that spoke last. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to climb, Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. He heard the soft laughter of the couple across the aisle. He smelled the buttery aroma of champagne being poured for another passenger. And then he heard the sharp clink of glass as a single tumbler of water slid across his tray table. He opened his eyes. The same attendant stood above him, lips pressed into a line. "That's all we have for now," she said flatly. Marcus looked at the water, then at her, then back at the water. Something inside him stirred. Quiet, patient, waiting. The story was only beginning. The cabin settled into a low hum as the plane leveled above the clouds. The city lights below flickered into darkness, swallowed by night, leaving only the glow of the cabin lights and the murmurs of luxury. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting the belt across his waist, and glanced toward the aisle. The same attendant, Claudia Monroe, moved gracefully from row to row, her smile returning as if a switch had been flipped. She leaned close to an older gentleman in seat 3C, pouring him a glass of red wine. She asked about his day, laughed softly at his small jokes, and offered him a choice of appetizers, warm cashews, or truffle crisps. The gentleman barely looked up, as if such courtesy was his birthright. When Claudia turned and caught Marcus watching, her smile faded once again. She shifted her tray, walked past his row without pausing, and greeted another passenger with the same cheer she had withheld from him. Marcus looked at his untouched glass of water. The condensation had spread across the napkin beneath it, bleeding into the fibers until it seemed as if the paper itself were wilting. He thought of all the boardrooms he had sat in, the polished tables and gold-lettered agendas, the way silence would sometimes fall when he entered. The world had changed, but not always as much as people pretended. Across the aisle, a couple in matching polo shirts ordered champagne. Claudia nodded quickly and returned moments later, balancing the tall, narrow flutes. The bubbles sparkled under the light. The couple clinked glasses, kissed lightly, and leaned back in comfort. In Marcus's row, nothing. No offer, no menu, no question. Only the slow drip of condensation on the napkin and the weight of absence. He tried to turn his mind elsewhere. He opened the leather-bound notebook he carried in his briefcase, scanning a list of tasks for the upcoming week: a keynote speech in New York, a strategy session with investors, a private dinner with a senator. Each item was heavy, significant. And yet, here, none of it seemed to matter. The silence around him grew louder with every laugh that rang from the other rows, with every cork popped, every plate of hors d'oeuvres sliding gracefully onto a tray table that wasn't his. Claudia reappeared, this time with a small cart. On it were gleaming plates of lobster tail, filet mignon, roasted asparagus, and bowls of steaming pasta. She moved down the aisle like a host at a private banquet. For you, sir, and for you, madam, excellent choice. When she reached Marcus, she did not stop. She angled the cart slightly away, blocking his view of the dishes, and wheeled it on. A minute later, she returned carrying a small plate. She set it down with the faintest thud. A single slice of bread, pale and dry, lay on a white dish. Next to it, another glass of water. She didn't look at him. She didn't explain. She only said, "This meal fits you better." The words hit harder than the gesture. A breath caught in his chest, sharp and unyielding. Around him, a few passengers shifted uncomfortably, some pretending not to hear, others smirking behind half-raised glasses. Marcus stared at the bread. The crust crumbled slightly under the cabin air, fragile and dry. He reached for it, not to eat, but to feel the weight of it in his hand. Light, insignificant, a symbol dressed as a meal. He placed the bread back on the plate and pushed it aside. His face was calm, his posture steady, but inside, his mind churned. He could hear his mother's voice again, reminding him that dignity is not something others give you. It's something you hold, no matter the circumstance. Still, the sting lingered. Marcus leaned back, folding his hands together. He thought of the company he had built from nothing but a vision, of the employees who looked to him not only for leadership, but for proof that barriers could be broken. He thought of the technology his team had crafted, the systems that watched over flights like this one. He knew the irony. The very network safeguarding this aircraft carried his signature, his design, his code. Yet none of that shielded him from the casual cruelty of a woman with a tray. The murmur of laughter rose again, punctuated by the clatter of cutlery. A man a few rows up called Claudia by her first name, and she giggled in reply. The sound echoed through the cabin, light and careless. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. He breathed through his nose, slow and deliberate. He would not give her what she wanted. Anger, raised voices, a scene those would only confirm the story she had already written about him. Instead, he opened his eyes and looked down at his phone. The screen glowed softly in the dim cabin. With a practiced thumb, he unlocked it, bypassing layers of security most people would never understand. His fingertip hovered over a single app, its icon a blue circle with a faint pulse running across it. AeroWatch. He didn't open it yet. Not now. Not while the bread still sat untouched beside him. Not while the air in the cabin vibrated with unspoken judgment. For now. He waited. He glanced out the window again. The stars scattered across the sky, endless and distant. Somewhere beneath the clouds, the dark plains of America stretched on, carrying millions of stories like his stories of men and women who paid the price, followed the rules, worked harder than anyone else, and still found themselves served less than crumbs. The bread remained on the plate. He would not touch it again. As the plane sped eastward, Marcus sat still, a storm brewing quietly inside him. His face betrayed nothing, but his heart carried a weight that grew heavier with every passing mile. The night was long, and the story had only just begun. Marcus sat motionless, the slice of bread still resting on the plate, like a reminder carved out of flour and air. Around him, the cabin thrived in its own comfort. Passengers clinked glasses, laughter rippled through the air, and the smell of roasted garlic and butter floated from tray tables that were not his. He let the noise fade into a dull hum, the way a man might tune out static, and found himself staring into the darkness outside the window. The stars stretched endlessly, but Marcus's mind was not in the sky. It was drifting back in time, pulled by memories he carried like invisible luggage. He saw himself as a boy, no more than 12, sitting on a cracked leather booth in a small-town diner in Alabama. His mother, elegant in her church dress, had asked for a slice of pecan pie. The waitress had tilted her head, glanced at the brown faces before her, and said, "We're out." 10 minutes later, Marcus had watched her deliver 2 slices to a white couple nearby, their forks already clinking against the plates. His mother had smiled as if nothing had happened, though her hand tightened around his. "Don't ever let their smallness define you, baby," she whispered. But Marcus had felt it, the quiet dismissal, the casual cruelty dressed in politeness. That moment had followed him through decades of education, boardrooms and airports. It was with him now, wrapped in the shape of a bread slice, tucked neatly onto a plate that mocked his presence. The engines roared softly beneath the floor. Marcus closed his eyes, remembering another moment. College. A professor, respected and sharp, had once questioned whether Marcus's scholarship was merit or mercy. The room had been silent, waiting for Marcus to shrink under the weight of insinuation. Instead, he had answered the professor's question with data so precise, so undeniable, that the man had stumbled over his own chalkboard. Marcus had learned then silence can cut, but evidence destroys. The seatbelt sign blinked off. Passengers rose, stretching, strolling to the restrooms. Marcus remained seated. Claudia passed him once more, her smile reappearing as she refilled a wine glass across the aisle, then disappearing as her eyes brushed over him. He wondered whether she realized how transparent she was, whether she understood how much she revealed with every flicker of her expression. Marcus leaned back, but his thoughts did not rest. He thought of Aero Watch, the company he had built from nothing but late nights and relentless vision. He thought of the algorithms that monitored crew performance, tracked passenger safety, and archived data in ways most airlines barely understood. Those systems bore his signature, his discipline, his refusal to accept mediocrity. He knew that, at this very moment, he could peel back the polished surface of this flight and expose what lay beneath. But he hesitated. Justice, he knew, was never simple. Retaliation was easy, immediate, gratifying. But justice required precision. Justice demanded patience. His mother's words echoed in his ears again. "Don't let their smallness define you." Marcus tapped a finger against the armrest. The temptation to act now was strong, yet a voice inside him, steady, calm, guiding, reminded him that the timing mattered. If he moved too quickly, it would be dismissed as anger. If he waited, if he gathered what was needed, the truth would speak with a voice louder than his own. He turned back to the cabin. A young businessman scrolled through his phone, oblivious. A woman scribbled in a notebook, her wine untouched beside her. In the corner, a flight attendant he hadn't noticed before, tall, younger, with earnest eyes arranged items in the galley. Their eyes met briefly. The attendant, Lars Whitman, gave a small nod, almost hesitant, then looked away quickly as Claudia entered the galley and barked a quiet instruction. Marcus caught the hesitation, the flicker of discomfort on Lars's face. Not everyone on this flight was blind to what was happening. The thought gave Marcus pause. He knew from years of leadership that systems were rarely broken because of one person. They broke because silence spread like infection. Claudia was not alone in her cruelty. The others' quiet compliance enabled her, yet sometimes there was someone within who wrestled with conscience. Marcus saw that flicker in Lars. He shifted in his seat, letting the idea settle. This was bigger than Claudia, bigger than one meal. It was about a culture that made her confident she could humiliate a paying passenger and expect no consequence. Marcus's phone buzzed softly in his palm. A message from his assistant scrolled across the screen. Safe flight. See you tomorrow for the investor roundtable. He typed back one word, boarding. He left it at that. He didn't have the language to explain what had unfolded. Not yet. The plane lurched gently as turbulence brushed its wings. Glasses clinked. A passenger gasped, then laughed nervously. Claudia made her way through the aisle again, steady on her feet, her smile intact for those she deemed worthy. For Marcus, only silence. He breathed in deeply, let the air fill his chest, and exhaled. A decision was forming inside him, solidifying like steel under heat. He would not let this pass into memory as another slice of bread, another shrug of humiliation. He had the means, he had the power, and above all, he had the responsibility. The memory of his mother, the echo of his professor, the silence of 1,000 moments of dismissal, all of it sharpened into a single truth. This night would not end like all the others. Marcus lifted the phone again, his thumb hovering over the Aero Watch icon. Not yet. Timing was everything. For now, he would wait, gathering not only data, but the weight of the moment. When he acted, it would be undeniable. The engines hummed steady, carrying the aircraft eastward. Marcus leaned back, his face unreadable, his eyes sharp. The boy from Alabama sat quietly in the man from Denver. And together, they knew the story was changing. Dinner service began in full swing, the scent of garlic butter and seared steak filling the cabin like a quiet announcement of privilege. White tablecloths slid across tray tables, silverware gleamed under the overhead lights, and the sound of corks being eased from bottles echoed softly in the air. The attendants moved like choreographed dancers, presenting dishes with the ease of long practice. For every passenger around him, the flight had transformed into a floating restaurant. For Marcus Ellington, it became something else entirely. Claudia Monroe returned with the cart once again, her steps precise, her smile polished for each face she approached. Lobster tails glistened under lemon wedges. Filet mignon sat steaming on porcelain plates, and even the vegetarian pasta dishes looked carefully garnished. Her voice carried just enough warmth to make passengers feel chosen. For you, sir, and for you, madam. Enjoy. When she stopped at Marcus's row, her posture changed. The warmth drained from her face as though a switch had been flipped. Without asking for his preference, without offering a menu, she placed a single plate in front of him. A slice of bread, pale and stiff, sat in the middle. Beside it, a glass of water. No garnish, no courtesy. Just a gesture meant to humiliate, wrapped in service protocol. Claudia didn't look at him as she set it down, but her words, quiet and sharp, carried enough weight. This meal fits you better." For a moment, the sounds of the cabin dimmed. Marcus heard only the rush of blood in his ears. He looked at the bread, then back at Claudia. Around him, passengers shifted uneasily. Some pretended not to notice. Others smirked into their champagne. One man across the aisle raised his brows, as if amused by the spectacle. Marcus didn't move. He didn't protest. He simply placed his hands together on his lap and regarded the plate with a composure that belied the storm inside him. He remembered again the diner in Alabama, his mother's quiet strength. He remembered the professor's smug smirk decades earlier. And now, here he was, a CEO of a company that had changed the very technology airlines used to keep passengers safe, reduced in the eyes of one woman to bread and water. Claudia moved on, her voice bright again for the next row. Marcus sat still. The bread remained untouched. The young attendant, Lars Whitman, passed soon after with a tray of wine refills. His eyes caught the plate in front of Marcus, and his steps faltered just slightly. He looked at Marcus, then at Claudia working down the aisle, and back again. A flicker of something regret. Hesitation flashed across his face. He opened his mouth, as if to say something, but closed it just as quickly. He moved on without a word. Marcus noticed. He always noticed. The silence of those who saw and did nothing was as loud as the cruelty itself. As the meal service continued, Marcus leaned back, folding his hands across his chest. He watched the others enjoy their courses, laughter punctuating each bite. Champagne bubbled, forks clinked against porcelain, and stories of vacations and business deals floated through the air. For him, silence was the only companion. Inside, his mind turned sharply. He weighed his options the way he would evaluate a business deal. He could say something now. Call Claudia out publicly. Create a scene that would make passengers whisper. He could demand to see the captain. But none of those paths would cut through the deeper problem. None of them would dismantle the arrogance that had let this moment happen at all. What Claudia had said wasn't just an insult. It was a symptom of a culture where some felt entitled to humiliate others because they assumed the silence would protect them. Marcus picked up the bread, felt its weightless fragility in his hand, and placed it back down. His jaw tightened. His patience had limits. He pulled his phone from his jacket again, its screen glowing softly in the dim light. His thumb hovered over the Arrow Watch icon. He thought of the systems at his command tools designed to ensure accountability, systems that could reach into the heart of this very flight and extract the truth. He thought of the responsibility that came with holding that power. He wasn't angry for himself alone. He was angry for the countless passengers who had endured this without the means to fight back, without the authority to force change. Marcus placed the phone back in his pocket. Not yet. Timing mattered. He would not act in the shadows of a meal. He would wait until the stage was set, until the truth could be revealed in the brightest possible light. He leaned back, eyes steady, watching Claudia glide past him once more, her laughter reserved for others. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know the decision already forming in his mind. The bread sat untouched. And Marcus knew this night would draw a line. Marcus Ellington sat perfectly still, though every muscle in his body ached to move. The bread remained on the plate, untouched, its pale crust glowing beneath the dim cabin lights like an accusation. Around him, dinner plates were cleared away, glasses topped with dessert wine, and laughter rippled between rows as though the air itself conspired to make him invisible. His mind, however, was anything but quiet. He had learned long ago that injustice rarely arrived with fanfare. It came instead through small gestures, soft voices, casual cruelty disguised as oversight. The bread was not just food. It was a signal, a reminder that to some, he would always be an intruder in a seat he had paid for, in a class he had earned 10 times over. Marcus closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engine settle against his thoughts. Inside, 2 voices argued. One urged him to rise, to call Claudia Monroe out in front of every passenger, to demand answers from the captain, to force accountability now, in real time. He could imagine the scene, the shocked faces, the embarrassed murmurs, the whispers spreading across the cabin. But another voice, quieter, steadier, urged restraint. This was not about humiliation repaid with humiliation. That path might soothe his pride, but it would not fix the disease underneath. Marcus had lived long enough to know that fighting fire with fire only left everyone burned. He breathed deeply, remembering his father's words. Strength isn't what you show in the moment. It's what you save for the moment that matters. That moment, Marcus knew, had not yet come. He opened his eyes and glanced toward the galley. Claudia moved briskly, gathering trays with a sharpness in her motions, her face returning to its mask of cheer whenever she approached a favored passenger. Lars Whitman, the younger attendant, followed a step behind her. Marcus noticed the way Lars's shoulders hunched slightly, the way his gaze flickered nervously whenever Claudia spoke. The boy was caught in the undertow of complicity, torn between silence and conscience. Marcus wondered whether Lars had seen this before, whether he had swallowed his discomfort in other flights, told himself it wasn't his place, convinced himself that silence was safer. Marcus almost pitied him. Almost. The captain's voice broke through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude at 36,000 feet. Smooth air ahead. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the service. His tone was professional, but Marcus couldn't help hearing the irony. Enjoy the service. He allowed himself the faintest smile, bitter at the edges. He reached for his phone again. Running a thumb over the AeroWatch icon without pressing it, he could, in seconds, access crew performance logs, complaint histories, even internal recordings from this flight. Every action Claudia had taken was already written into the system, waiting to be retrieved. Marcus carried in his pocket the power to unravel the facade she hid behind. But power, he reminded himself, was nothing without purpose. His chest tightened as he remembered a conversation with his daughter 2 weeks earlier. She had asked him, "Daddy, do people always have to be mean before they can change?" He had knelt in front of her, kissed her forehead, and said, "No, sweetheart. Sometimes they just don't see. Sometimes you have to show them." That memory now rose like a lantern in the dark. He could show them, not by shouting, not by throwing the bread back at Claudia, but by using the truth, undeniable and documented, to reveal what lay beneath the polished surface of this flight. Still, doubt whispered in the corners of his mind. What if acting now ruined the merger his company was negotiating with this very airline? What if investors saw him as volatile, reckless? What if the headlines reduced him to the angry black man on a plane? Ignoring the substance for the spectacle, Marcus's fingers tightened around the armrest. He had spent a lifetime building credibility brick by brick, each success laid carefully to protect against the winds of prejudice. Was he willing to risk it all on one flight, one insult, one slice of bread? The question lingered, heavy as the engine's steady roar. He turned his gaze back to the window. Below, the country stretched in darkness, towns and highways glowing faintly like veins of light. Somewhere down there, People sat at dinner tables, kissed children goodnight, argued, laughed, dreamed. Life moved forward, indifferent to what happened 36,000 feet above. But Marcus knew better. Stories like this didn't vanish. They echoed. They shaped perception, gave permission, fueled silence. If he let this one pass, if he let Claudia's words dissolve into the night, then silence would win again. He shifted slightly, straightened his tie, and breathed with renewed steadiness. He would act, but not yet. He would choose his moment with precision. The truth, when revealed, would be undeniable. Lars appeared again, moving down the aisle with coffee service. When he reached Marcus's row, he hesitated. "Would you care for some?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a hint of awkwardness. Marcus looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Nope, thank you." His tone was calm, but his eyes spoke louder. He saw the hesitation in Lars, the unspoken guilt. He knew the young man was not blind. As Lars moved on, Marcus allowed himself another thought. Perhaps not everyone here was beyond reach. Perhaps conscience, though quiet, still had a foothold. The bread remained untouched. But Marcus's resolve hardened with every mile. He would not explode in anger. He would not allow himself to be reduced to a caricature. When his moment came, it would arrive with the weight of undeniable evidence, with the precision of truth itself. And when it did, the silence that shielded Claudia would shatter. The cabin lights dimmed further, shifting into a soft glow meant to coax passengers toward sleep. Trays had been cleared, wine glasses emptied, and blankets handed out to those preparing for a quiet night above the clouds. The atmosphere was serene, almost lulling, but Marcus Ellington felt none of it. Beneath his calm exterior, the silence pressed against him like a storm held behind glass. Claudia Monroe passed once more, her smile flashing brightly at a passenger who asked for a refill of cognac. Her voice was smooth, light, as though the insult she had delivered earlier had never existed. Marcus noticed the ease with which she moved, the confidence in her stride. She believed herself untouchable. To her, the bread on his tray was nothing more than a joke she would forget before the plane touched down. But Marcus would not forget. He slipped his phone from his jacket pocket, the faint glow lighting his face in the dim cabin. He unlocked it with practiced ease, and the Aero Watch app appeared. The blue circle pulsed faintly, a heartbeat of technology. For a moment, his finger hovered. He thought again of his daughter's question. Do people always have to be mean before they can change? He thought of his mother's hand squeezing his in that diner. He thought of every quiet dismissal that had piled into the man he had become. Then he tapped the icon. The screen unfolded into a dashboard designed for precision. Rows of data streamed down: crew activity logs, service records, internal communication pings. Aero Watch was not built to spy. It was built to monitor accountability. Every step a flight attendant took, every passenger interaction, every logged request recorded, time-stamped, stored. Marcus knew these systems better than anyone. He had designed them for airlines to protect passengers and crews alike. Now, ironically, he was both passenger and judge. His eyes scanned quickly. Claudia Monroe's record was there: flagged incidents, minor complaints. Nothing escalated. Yet Marcus saw the pattern immediately. The complaints shared a thread: subtle discrimination. Passengers of color consistently reporting being ignored, belittled, or served differently. The reports had been quietly filed away, marked as resolved without further action. Marcus's jaw tightened. He scrolled further, his finger moving with sharp precision. Captain Jonathan Reed's name appeared next. The pilot's record was clean on paper, but Marcus spotted the discrepancies. Complaints from crew members about his tendency to dismiss reports of bias as passenger sensitivity. None of those complaints had reached higher management. Someone in the chain had been protecting the culture instead of correcting it. His thumb moved again, pulling security feeds from the cabin. AeroWatch accessed the discrete cameras mounted in the ceiling standard practice for safety monitoring. The images flickered onto his phone screen, Claudia leaning warmly toward one passenger, rolling her eyes toward another, her face shifting like a mask. And there it was, the moment she placed the bread in front of him, her lips moving with the words, "He would not forget this meal fits you better." The footage caught it all. Evidence undeniable. Marcus sat back, the phone glowing in his palm. The storm inside him shifted, no longer directionless. He had what he needed, but evidence alone meant nothing unless wielded with intent. He thought of the merger his company was negotiating with this airline, a deal worth hundreds of millions, a partnership meant to modernize their entire operational system. Walking away would be simple, but walking away without forcing change would only let the rot continue. He had to strike not only at Claudia, but at the culture that allowed her arrogance to thrive. Marcus opened a secure channel, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. A code only he and two executives in his company knew unlocked deeper systems. A single phrase appeared at the top: "Activate internal audit." He hesitated for a second. Once he pressed send, the wheels would turn immediately, data pulled, logs analyzed, reports filed directly to the highest executives of the airline. This was no longer personal. It was systemic. He pressed send. The confirmation message flashed: audit initiated. Report in progress. The hum of the engines filled the silence as Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket. Around him, passengers reclined, oblivious to the shift that had just occurred 36,000 feet above ground. Claudia walked past again, the same mask of indifference on her face. She had no idea that every step, every sneer, every word she had spoken was now part of a file she could not escape. Marcus folded his hands in his lap, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. To anyone watching, he was just another passenger settling into the night. But inside, the quiet battle had tipped into action. The call had been made. The system was moving. Lars Whitman emerged from the galley, carrying a tray of water bottles for passengers who requested them. His eyes lingered again on Marcus, on the untouched bread still sitting there. Something in his face softened, as though he understood the weight of what had been done. Marcus gave him a steady look, not unkind, but unwavering. Lars shifted, swallowed, and continued down the aisle. The intercom buzzed again. Captain Reed's voice carried over the cabin, professional and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in New York ahead of schedule. We'll have you on the ground in just over 2 hours. Enjoy the remainder of your flight." Marcus exhaled slowly. Ahead of schedule? Indeed. For more than just the landing, the evidence was in motion. The truth was gathering momentum. And soon, when the wheels touched the runway, the silence that had shielded Claudia Monroe and Captain Jonathan Reed would no longer hold. The cabin had grown quieter, with most passengers reclining under blankets, eyes closed, earbuds in place. Yet for Marcus Ellington, the night was wide awake. He sat in the half-dark, his phone screen casting a faint glow on his face as lines of data assembled themselves like pieces of a puzzle. AeroWatch was working in real time, and Marcus could feel the pulse of the system moving as though it were his own heartbeat. The audit report was already unfolding. AeroWatch had combed through thousands of internal records in minutes, pulling every instance where Claudia Monroe's name appeared. The pattern was undeniable. Complaints that read almost identically, dismissive, hostile, singled out, treated differently. Passengers describing feeling invisible or ridiculed. Many of the complainants were people of color, families, or women traveling alone. Each file had been closed quickly, marked with the sterile language of bureaucracy resolved with staff coaching, yet no actual notes of coaching existed. Marcus's jaw set as he scrolled further. Aerowatch had pulled related files, tracing threads that connected Claudia to Captain Jonathan Reed. Several crew members had submitted concerns about Claudia's behavior, only to have them dismissed at the captain's discretion. Reed had described them as passengers misinterpreting tone or crew over-reporting minor conflicts. The paper trail told the truth. Reed had shielded Claudia again and again. The audit widened. The system flagged anomalies in crew scheduling. Claudia was repeatedly rotated into first-class assignments, despite her performance scores lagging behind others. The reason a scheduling manager with a personal friendship with her family favors buried under routine paperwork, nepotism dressed as normality. Marcus's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a rude attendant with a cruel remark. This was a structure protecting itself, quietly ensuring that bias and arrogance never faced consequences. A silent conspiracy of paperwork and dismissal. A soft knock on his consciousness came when Lars Whitman passed again, tidying blankets. The young attendant slowed near Marcus's row, glancing once more at the untouched bread still sitting defiantly on the tray. His lips pressed together, hesitation burning in his eyes. He leaned just slightly closer, his voice hushed. I saw what happened earlier. Marcus turned his head. His gaze was calm, steady. He didn't answer, letting silence draw Lars further. The boy swallowed. It wasn't right. She cut himself off as Claudia's voice rang from the galley, calling his name sharply. He straightened, cheeks reddening, and hurried away. Marcus let out a slow breath. So the boy did see. Conscience still flickered, even in a culture of silence. It wasn't much, but it was a sign. His phone buzzed again. The report updated, highlighting key findings. At the bottom appeared a flashing line: recommendation escalate to executive oversight. Severity critical. The system had recognized what Marcus already knew. This was not an isolated issue. It was a systemic flaw, a cultural rot. He felt the old war inside him stir again, the boy in Alabama who wanted to shout at the unfairness, and the man who had learned to wield patience like a weapon. His fingers hovered over the option to transmit the report directly to the airline's executive leadership. He could press it now, and by the time the plane landed, senior management would be waiting at the gate. But still, he paused. It wasn't hesitation born of fear. It was strategy. Timing mattered. He wanted Claudia and Reed to walk off this plane believing they had gotten away with it. He wanted the curtain to drop only when the stage was full, when the truth would burn brightest. Marcus closed the report, tucking the phone back into his pocket. His decision was made. He would deliver the evidence, but not yet. Not until the wheels hit the runway and there was no escape into the safety of the skies. He leaned back, exhaling. The hum of the engines filled the silence again. Around him, passengers dreamed in ignorance, unaware that a quiet revolution was moving under their feet. The boy in Alabama had grown into a man with the power to see through walls, to peel back the lie systems told to protect themselves. And that man knew by the time this night ended, the story would belong not just to him, but to everyone who had ever been served bread when they deserved a meal. Marcus Ellington sat with his eyes fixed on the seat back ahead, though his mind was far away. The evidence now sat secure in his phone, a complete record of what Claudia Monroe had done, what Captain Jonathan Reed had ignored, and what the airline had buried for months, perhaps years. He had the power to end their careers with a single press of a button. Yet as the quiet hum of the engines filled the cabin, Marcus found himself locked in an internal trial, one side of his conscience against the other. He thought first of anger. Anger was simple. Anger was immediate. He could imagine himself standing, raising his voice so that every passenger in this first-class cabin would hear the truth of what Claudia had done. He could expose her cruelty in real time, make her feel the same humiliation she had tried to deliver to him. The thought had a sharp satisfaction to it, a clean strike, but satisfaction was fleeting. Once the moment passed, it would be remembered only as a conflict on a plane, another viral clip of shouting in the skies. It would not touch the system underneath. Then came the voice of restraint. Justice, it said, was not about humiliating one person. Justice was about dismantling the foundation that allowed arrogance to masquerade as authority. If Marcus acted too quickly, the airline would find a way to frame the narrative, dismissing the event as a misunderstanding or painting him as overreacting. If he waited, if he timed it with precision, he could bring down not only Claudia's mask but the silence that shielded her. His father's voice rose in his memory, a deep baritone full of conviction. Son, revenge feeds the moment. Justice feeds the future. You decide which one you want to carry. Marcus closed his eyes, breathing in deeply. He had carried anger before. He knew how heavy it became when it outlived its usefulness. What he wanted now was not the weight of revenge, but the light of change. Still, the temptation gnawed at him. His chest tightened as he replayed Claudia's words. This meal fits you better, their sting sharper than the bread itself. To remain calm in the face of such cruelty was not weakness, but endurance had its limits. He opened his eyes and glanced at the bread again, sitting untouched like a taunt. He clenched his fists once, then released them. A rustle beside him drew his attention. The man across the aisle, who had smirked earlier, leaned slightly toward Marcus. Tough night, huh? He whispered with a half grin, as though the humiliation were some private joke between them. Marcus studied him quietly, his face unreadable. He gave no reply, only turned his gaze back to the window. Silence, once again, was sharper than words. The man shifted uncomfortably and retreated into his seat. Marcus let the silence linger. But inside, the debate returned. Could justice coexist with mercy? If he moved forward with this audit, Claudia and Reed would lose more than their jobs. Their names would be attached to a scandal that might follow them for the rest of their lives. He thought of his daughter again, asking why people had to be mean. What lesson would he give her, that cruelty deserves destruction, or that accountability can still leave room for redemption? His phone buzzed softly with an update. The audit report had tagged Lars Whitman, the young attendant. It flagged his inconsistencies during service moments where he appeared hesitant, moments where he complied, but without conviction. AeroWatch's algorithm categorized him as non-dominant influence, essentially labeling him as someone caught in the system's current rather than directing it. Marcus looked up just as Lars emerged from the galley, carrying a tray of fresh coffee for a passenger in 3B. Their eyes met again. This time, Marcus offered the faintest nod. Lars blinked, startled, but his lips parted as though he understood something unspoken. He gave a small, nearly imperceptible nod in return, before moving on. That single exchange steadied Marcus's thoughts. Here was a reminder that not everyone within a broken system was beyond hope. Some were prisoners of silence, waiting for the moment someone else broke it first. He leaned back in his seat, the debate inside him softening into clarity. He would act. Yes. He would hold Claudia and Reed accountable. Absolutely. But he would also ensure the truth extended beyond 2 names on a report. He would use this moment to crack open the culture that had protected them. Justice, not revenge. Change, not spectacle. He allowed himself a small smile, invisible to most in the dim cabin. He thought of his daughter again, of her wide eyes waiting for answers. He whispered under his breath, barely audible even to himself, "No, sweetheart. They don't always have to be mean. Sometimes they just have to see." The decision settled over him like armor. He would not lash out. He would wait for the ground, for the eyes of management, for the undeniable weight of evidence. And when he acted, it would not be for his pride, but for everyone who had ever been handed bread when they deserved more. The engines droned on, carrying the plane eastward. Marcus rested his hand lightly over the phone in his pocket, feeling its quiet pulse like a second heartbeat. The audit was ready, the truth waiting. All that remained was the right moment. The cabin of flight UA 428 had grown hushed. But it was not the calm of peace. It was the hush of something unspoken pressing against the walls, like a storm cloud gathering beyond the glass. Passengers nestled into their seats, some dozing, some watching movies, some sipping the last of their wine. On the surface, everything was routine, but Marcus Ellington felt the undercurrent, a current that ran directly through him. Claudia Monroe strolled down the aisle again, heels clicking softly against the carpet. She adjusted a blanket here, collected a glass there, smiling warmly at every passenger she deemed worthy of her attention. When she reached Marcus's row, her smile thinned, evaporated, and her eyes hardened for the briefest of seconds. She did not stop to ask if he needed anything. She walked past as if he were a shadow in her periphery. Marcus did not look away. He tracked her until she disappeared back into the galley, her laughter carrying faintly through the curtain as she joked with Captain Jonathan Reed over the intercom phone. Even without hearing the words, Marcus could tell by her tone that she was comfortable. Too comfortable. The bread remained on his tray table, now stale, edges curling slightly in the dry cabin air. It sat like a piece of evidence, silent but undeniable. Marcus had left it there deliberately, a symbol of what had been done. Every time Claudia or Lars passed, they saw it. And every time, it reminded them that silence does not erase what happened. A ripple of unease drifted through the rows when one passenger, emboldened by too much wine, leaned toward Marcus with a sneer. "Guess they're cutting back on meals these days." Huh. The tone was mocking, a cruel attempt at humor. A few passengers chuckled softly, more out of nervousness than agreement. Marcus turned his head slowly, meeting the man's eyes. His gaze was calm, steady, so unwavering that the man's grin faltered almost immediately. Words were unnecessary. The silence itself became a mirror, forcing the man to see his own pettiness reflected back. He shifted uncomfortably and sank into his seat, mumbling something under his breath. It wasn't just Claudia anymore. Marcus could feel the tension radiating from those around him, passengers who had witnessed the small humiliations but chose to rationalize them. That was the culture silence stretching itself thin across injustice, hoping it would dissolve if no one spoke of it. But silence was a brittle shield. and Marcus knew it was already beginning to crack. Lars appeared once again, this time with a tray of small desserts, chocolate mousse, fruit tarts, cheese plates. His movements were slower now, more deliberate. When he reached Marcus's row, he hesitated. His eyes flickered from the bread to Marcus's face, then to Claudia emerging from the galley. His lips parted as though he wanted to offer something, to break the script. But Claudia's voice cut in sharply. "Move along. Lars." The young attendant stiffened, cheeks coloring. He placed the tray down on the table across the aisle, avoiding Marcus's gaze, and hurried on. Claudia followed with her cart, her laughter forced, her posture rigid. She didn't even glance at Marcus. The air in the cabin thickened. Passengers shifted, sensing the unspoken conflict. Some glanced curiously at Marcus's tray, at the bread that still sat untouched. A woman in 2C pursed her lips, shaking her head slightly as though to say she saw what was happening but had no courage to intervene. Marcus sat still, hands folded, his phone heavy in his pocket. The audit was complete, the evidence undeniable, but he remained patient. Timing was everything. He wanted the truth to unfold not in whispers, but in a blaze that no one could ignore. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane cut across the night sky. Captain Reed's voice returned briefly over the intercom, casual and dismissive. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making excellent time. Sit back and enjoy the rest of your flight." The irony did not escape Marcus. Enjoy. The word hung in the air like an insult. Marcus shifted slightly, his mind alive with thought. He recalled years of corporate battles where he had faced dismissals, evasions, outright lies. He had learned that silence could be powerful, but silence wielded strategically was unstoppable. Let Claudia believe she had won. Let Reed continue in his careless dismissal. They would not see the trap until it was too late. Another hour passed. The cabin grew darker still, most passengers now drifting into uneasy sleep. Marcus remained awake, his eyes fixed on the faint glow of the seatback screen, though he did not watch it. He was listening to the whispers of passengers, to the nervous movements of Lars, to the brittle confidence in Claudia's laughter. The tension in the air had become its own kind of music, rising toward a crescendo. Finally, Lars passed by again, this time without Claudia trailing close. He slowed, glancing quickly over his shoulder, then leaned slightly toward Marcus. His voice was almost a whisper. I know it's not my place, but I just want to say I'm sorry." His eyes darted nervously. "It shouldn't have happened like that." Marcus studied him for a long moment. The young man's face was pale, his jaw tense, but his sincerity was clear. Marcus gave a single nod. Nothing more. It was enough. Lars straightened quickly, hurrying on before Claudia could reappear. But that moment hung between them, proof that even within silence, conscience could still speak. Marcus rested his hand against the phone in his pocket, feeling the pulse of Aerowatch waiting. The time for silence was nearly over. Soon, the curtain would lift, and when it did, the tension that filled this cabin would break like a storm. The announcement came over the intercom, crisp and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our initial descent into New York. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Captain Jonathan Reed's voice carried the tone of routine, but for Marcus Ellington, the words marked the moment he had been waiting for. The cabin stirred awake. Passengers pulled headphones from their ears, adjusted seatbacks, folded blankets. Attendants moved briskly, collecting stray cups and trash. Claudia Monroe emerged from the galley, her smile bright as ever, her confidence unshaken. She greeted passengers with warmth, bending down to speak softly to one, adjusting the pillow of another. When she neared Marcus, her eyes flickered briefly toward the bread still sitting untouched on his tray table. A shadow passed across her face before she smoothed it back into indifference. She didn't speak to him. She didn't need to. Marcus watched her, silent, his hand resting over his phone. The audit report waited inside, a hammer poised above glass. Soon the landing gear would lower, the wheels would touch ground, and the silence that had shielded Claudia and Reed would shatter under the weight of truth. The engine shifted tone as the plane descended. City lights began to glow faintly beneath the clouds, New York stretching out like a constellation on Earth. Marcus looked out the window, the grid of streets sharp and brilliant, and felt the final pieces of his decision lock into place. He unlocked his phone, navigating swiftly to the secure channel. A single press transmitted the full report to the airline's executive oversight system. Within seconds, automated alerts triggered at headquarters. Executives in New York, Chicago, and Dallas would be waking to notifications marked Priority 1. The report included the cabin footage, crew logs, complaint history, and Marcus's own time-stamped account. The system did not allow deletion, did not allow delay. Once sent, it was permanent. Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression calm. He had not raised his voice, had not thrown the bread, had not caused a scene. And yet, before the wheels even touched the runway, justice was already moving faster than the aircraft itself. The nose of the plane dipped lower, the city lights brighter now. Claudia passed once more, checking belts, reminding passengers to stow trays. Her eyes avoided Marcus's, though she lingered a half-second too long on the bread still in place. The symbol she had meant as mockery had become a silent indictment, one she could not erase. Lars Whitman followed behind her, his steps slower, more thoughtful. He paused at Marcus's row, lowering his voice so only Marcus could hear. "Something's going to happen, isn't it?" Marcus looked at him, steady, offering no details, only a quiet nod. Lars swallowed and moved on, his face pale, but his shoulders straighter. The boy had chosen his side. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud. The plane shuddered slightly as it cut through the final stretch of clouds. Passengers murmured, some adjusting ties, others pulling coats from overhead bins prematurely. The anticipation of arrival filled the cabin, but for Marcus, anticipation carried another weight. The wheels struck the runway with a roar, brakes engaging, engines reversing. The aircraft slowed, the runway lights streaking past the windows. Applause broke from a few passengers, as it often did. But Marcus remained silent, his eyes forward. He could feel the shift beginning. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Marcus's phone vibrated. A secure message flashed across the screen. Audit report received. Action team deployed. Await ground instructions. He exhaled, slow and steady. The machinery was already in motion. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers rose, collecting bags, stretching limbs. Claudia moved quickly, helping one with a coat, handing another their belongings. She smiled easily, laughing at a passenger's joke, her voice carrying through the cabin like nothing was amiss. But Marcus knew. He could see the cracks beneath the mask, the stiffness in her shoulders, the faint glance she cast toward him before looking away. Somewhere inside her, she knew. The jet bridge connected with a metallic thud. The cabin door opened. Light from the terminal spilled inside. And there they stood two security officers in dark uniforms, flanked by a woman in a tailored suit carrying a slim folder. The chatter of passengers stilled as the officials stepped aboard. Claudia froze mid-sentence, her smile faltering. Captain Reed emerged from the cockpit, his face tightening at the sight. The woman in the suit spoke calmly, her tone cutting through the cabin. "Captain Jonathan Reed, Flight Attendant Claudia Monroe, you will come with us." Gas rippled through the rows. Claudia blinked, confusion and denial flashing across her face. What, there must be some mistake. But the security officers stepped closer, firm, leaving no room for argument. Reed's jaw clenched, his hand tightening on the cockpit doorframe. On what grounds, he demanded. The woman opened the folder, her voice steady. On the grounds of multiple verified misconduct reports, corroborated by audit evidence collected in flight. You will be debriefed immediately. Claudia's eyes darted wildly, first to Reed, then across the cabin. She landed briefly on Marcus. Her mouth opened, then closed. No words came. Passengers whispered among themselves, shocked, curious, unsettled. Some pulled out phones, already recording. Others looked at Marcus now with widened eyes, piecing together what had transpired. The bread still sat on his tray, silent proof that even the smallest gesture could unravel into something larger than anyone imagined. Marcus remained seated, composed, hands folded neatly in his lap. He did not gloat, did not smirk, did not acknowledge Claudia's panicked stare. He let the silence speak. He had no need to add words. The truth was louder than anything he could say. The officers guided Claudia and Reed down the aisle, past the stunned passengers. Reed's face was flushed with anger, Claudia's with disbelief. Lars trailed in the background, eyes wide, his expression conflicted, but also strangely relieved. As they disappeared through the cabin door, Marcus rose at last. He reached into his pocket, removed the phone, and checked the confirmation again. The audit was secure, the process irreversible. Claudia and Reed would face not only suspension, but a thorough investigation that would reach the highest levels of the airline. Marcus adjusted his tie, picked up his carry-on, and glanced once more at the bread on the tray. He left it there, untouched, as a reminder of what had started this night. Then he stepped calmly into the aisle, moving toward the door with the composure of a man who had fought his battle in silence and won. The jet bridge was thick with murmurs as passengers filed out, some whispering in shock, others speaking into their phones as though they had stumbled into the center of a breaking news story. Marcus Ellington walked among them, unhurried, his stride even, his face composed. To an onlooker, he was simply another first-class traveler leaving a late-night flight. But within him, the gravity of the moment pressed deeply. Just beyond the exit, in the wide corridor of the terminal, a cluster of uniformed personnel stood waiting. The airline's ground security had formed a discreet perimeter, but there was nothing discreet about the tension in the air. Captain Jonathan Reed was already there, flanked by two officers. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrowed, fury barely concealed. Claudia Monroe stood nearby, her cheeks flushed, her words tumbling in protest. "This is ridiculous. I've done nothing wrong." "This is some kind of overreaction," her voice carried, attracting the attention of passengers still spilling out of the jet bridge. Some paused at a distance, filming discreetly, their lenses capturing what they would soon upload to the world. The woman in the tailored suit, the airline's operations manager, stepped forward, her voice cool but unyielding. "Miss Monroe, the audit is conclusive. We will review this further in a controlled environment. For now, you are relieved of duty." Claudia's mouth opened, then snapped shut. She turned sharply, her eyes locking on Marcus. The look was not just anger, it was disbelief, as though she had just begun to realize who he was. Her lips trembled, but no words formed. She looked away quickly, her defiance crumbling under the weight of inevitability. Marcus watched her without expression. He felt no triumph in her unraveling, only the cold clarity of accountability finally being served. Captain Reed, however, was not as silent. "This is absurd," he snapped, stepping toward the manager. "I've flown for this airline for 15 years. You think you can drag me off a flight because of some glitch in a monitoring system? This is harassment." The manager remained steady. "Captain Reed, the system doesn't glitch. The report is clear. You ignored multiple complaints, dismissed crew concerns, and enabled misconduct. You'll have your chance to speak during the investigation. Until then, you're suspended." Reed's face darkened, his nostrils flaring. He glanced at Marcus briefly, and in that glance was a flash of recognition. He finally understood who Marcus was, the man behind the system that had just dismantled his authority. For a brief second, their eyes locked, the seasoned pilot against the quiet CEO. Reed's glare carried accusation, as though Marcus were the architect of his downfall. Marcus, calm and unflinching, met it without a word. He didn't need to say anything. The truth was already louder than either of them. Passengers nearby whispered, their voices rising. "Did you see? They took the captain. That's the guy in 2A. Phones hovered in the air, catching Marcus's image as he walked past. He heard fragments of speculation, some supportive, some skeptical, but he didn't pause. The story was no longer his to narrate. It was already in the hands of witnesses. As he approached the end of the jet bridge, a voice called after him, "Sir, Mr.?" Ellington Marcus turned slightly. It was Lars Whitman, standing just beyond the commotion, his uniform slightly rumpled, his face pale but resolute. He looked younger under the harsh fluorescent lights, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had finally chosen. I just wanted to say," Lars stammered, "what happened on that plane, it wasn't right. I should have spoken up sooner. I'm sorry." His words tumbled out, raw, almost desperate. "If there's an investigation, I'll tell them everything. I won't stay silent again." Marcus regarded him quietly. The young man's sincerity was undeniable. But Marcus also saw the fear, the recognition of how dangerous it was to break ranks, to step outside silence. For a moment, Marcus considered offering him reassurance, telling him it would be all right. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on Lars's shoulder. "Do what's right," Marcus said simply. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of conviction. "That's all that matters." Lars nodded quickly, relief and determination mingling in his expression. His shoulders straightened as though a burden had lifted. Marcus released his shoulder and continued walking, his steps carrying him into the terminal's bright expanse. The noise behind him faded, though he knew it would echo far beyond these walls. The viral machinery of the world had already been set in motion. By morning, millions would see the footage, hear the whispers, share the outrage. He reached the end of the concourse where a black sedan waited. His driver opened the door silently. Marcus slid inside, the city's lights stretching like a living constellation beyond the glass. As the car pulled away from the terminal, he allowed himself to exhale deeply for the first time in hours. The battle on the plane was over. But the war against the culture that had allowed it to happen was only beginning. He leaned back in the leather seat, eyes closed briefly. His phone buzzed again. Another secure message. Executive leadership requesting immediate meeting. Audit evidence received. Action plan pending. Marcus opened his eyes, staring at the city skyline. The real reckoning was only beginning. The boardroom on the 32nd floor of Orion Airlines headquarters was a far cry from the hushed cabin of Flight UA-128. Here, the light was harsh, bouncing off polished steel and glass. A long mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by executives in tailored suits. The city skyline glittered through the windows, but no one was looking at it. Every eye in the room was fixed on the large screen at the front, where the footage from the flight played silently on loop. Marcus Ellington sat at one end of the table, his posture calm, his presence commanding without force. He had been ushered in only minutes earlier, yet already the room carried his gravity. Executives whispered among themselves, their voices taut with unease. The audit report lay printed before them, thick as a novel, its pages filled with timestamps, passenger complaints, crew records, and the damning footage of Claudia Monroe sneering as she placed the bread before Marcus. The CEO of Orion Airlines, Richard Halloran, leaned forward, his face pale, his hands clasped together tightly. "Mr. Ellington," he began, his voice measured but strained. "First, allow me to personally apologize on behalf of this airline. What happened on that flight was unacceptable." Marcus regarded him steadily. He did not nod, did not smile. "Unacceptable," he said, his voice low. "Even is a word too often used to end conversations. What matters is whether you will begin one." The words hung heavy in the air. Executives shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging quick glances. Halloran cleared his throat. "The individuals involved, Captain Reed and Miss Monroe, have already been suspended. Their employment will be terminated pending full investigation, but," he hesitated, then pressed on, "this audit has revealed far deeper issues. Patterns of complaints buried, reports dismissed, favoritism influencing scheduling. It's clear we failed to uphold accountability." Marcus allowed the silence to stretch, watching the unease deepen. He had learned long ago that silence often compelled truth better than anger. Finally, another voice broke in. Margaret Steele, head of customer relations. "Mr. Ellington, if I may, this incident has already gone viral. Videos from passengers are circulating online. Hashtags are trending. Mass bread is not service. Oh, flying while black. Public sentiment is turning fast." The phrase made Marcus's lips tighten slightly. Bread as mockery had transformed into bread as movement. The world was watching, and the airline had no shield strong enough to withstand it. A younger executive spoke up, his voice quick, nervous. "If this gains more traction, we're looking at boycotts, cancellations, shareholders demanding answers. We need a strategy for damage control." Marcus's gaze swept across the table, his voice cutting through their panic. "Damage control," he repeated. "If your concern is only the noise, then you've learned nothing. This is not about silencing outrage. It's about addressing the reason outrage exists." The room stilled again. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his words deliberate. "You've built a culture where silence protects those who harm and punishes those who speak. That is not a glitch. That is design. And design can be rewritten." Halloran exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "Then help us rewrite it," he said quietly. "What do you propose?" Marcus rested his hands on the table. "Transparency. Every complaint logged through AeroWatch must be reviewed by an independent equity board, not buried by captains or managers with personal ties. Anonymous passenger feedback must be standard on every flight. Bias training is not a seminar, it is an ongoing accountability system with consequences for failure. And oversight cannot be optional. It must be structural. Murmurs filled the room. Some nodded reluctantly. Others frowned as though calculating costs. Marcus continued, "You treat bias as if it were a PR issue. It is not. It is an operational risk. When passengers do not trust that they will be treated with dignity, you lose not only customers, but legitimacy. You cannot repair that with an apology tweet. You repair it with systems stronger than the silence that allowed this to happen." The room fell quiet. Finally, Steele spoke again. "Mr. Ellington, if you're willing, would you serve as advisor during this restructuring your system? Your vision, it's clear we need it." Marcus hesitated, his mind flickering briefly to his daughter, to her wide-eyed question. He thought of the boy he once was, standing in a diner while his mother shielded him from humiliation. He thought of Lars Whitman, a young attendant trying to find his courage. This was not just about him. It was about everyone who would sit in a seat tomorrow, next month, next year, wondering if dignity would meet them there. "Yes," Marcus said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "But understand this, I am not here to protect your brand. I am here to protect your passengers. If that costs you, so be it." Halloran nodded slowly, the weight of the words sinking in. Around the table, no one argued. The meeting adjourned with promises of immediate action. But Marcus knew words were fragile things. Action would prove their worth. As he left the boardroom, his phone buzzed again with messages, news outlets requesting comment, social media exploding with speculation, allies and critics alike reaching out. He ignored them for now. Stepping into the night air outside the building, Marcus inhaled deeply. The city lights glittered. Cars rushed past. Voices echoed along the street. He felt the exhaustion of the night settling into his bones, but beneath it, a quiet strength remained. The reckoning had begun. The system had been forced to look at itself, and though resistance would come, change had been set in motion. Marcus walked toward his waiting car, his reflection briefly catching in the glass door of the building behind him. For the first time since boarding flight UA-RT-28, he allowed himself the faintest smile, not of victory, but of resolve. By dawn, the story had already ignited across the nation. The first passenger video uploaded from flight UA-128 had crossed 500,000 views before sunrise. By mid-morning, every major news outlet had picked it up. Clips of Claudia Monroe's dismissive smirk, of her placing bread on Marcus Ellington's tray, were replayed with commentary that ranged from stunned disbelief to outright condemnation. Screens across America showed the same scene on repeat on morning shows, in airports, on social media feeds. Headlines scrolled in bold, Black CEO humiliated in first class. Audit reveals airline bias scandal. Bread is not service goes viral. The hashtags trended for hours. Millions of users added their voices, sharing their own stories of being dismissed, ridiculed, or treated differently in the air. Marcus sat in his study at home, his phone vibrating nonstop with notifications. His daughter, Maya, padded into the room still in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy, everyone's talking about you on the news," she said softly. He lifted her into his lap, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I know, sweetheart," he said gently. "And what are they saying?" She frowned, thinking that someone was mean to you, but that you didn't yell. You showed them the truth instead. Marcus studied her face, the innocence in her eyes colliding with the weight of the moment. "That's right," he whispered. "Sometimes the truth is louder than shouting." His wife, Dana, entered with a cup of coffee, setting it beside him. Her gaze lingered on the screen, where Claudia's face froze mid-smirk. "It's everywhere," she said quietly. "You've started something." Marcus exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "No," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "The passengers started it when they hit record. The world started it when they said enough. I just happened to be holding the evidence by noon." Marcus was ushered into a studio for a live interview. Bright lights bore down as the anchor greeted him with a practiced smile. "Mr. Ellington, thank you for joining us. The country is watching. Millions are asking the same question. Why didn't you confront Ms. Monroe directly on the flight? Why stay silent until after landing?" Marcus folded his hands, his voice calm, measured. "Because silence can be strategy. If I had raised my voice, the story would have been about conflict. By waiting, the story became about accountability. And accountability doesn't end with one person. It exposes the system that protects them." The anchor nodded, impressed. "And what do you say to those who claim this was just one bad employee, not reflective of the airline?" Marcus's eyes sharpened slightly. When a system buries complaints, when leadership dismisses concerns, when favoritism overrides fairness that is not one person, that is culture, and culture must change. The clip went viral within minutes. Social media erupted with praise. He stayed calm. He stayed smart. That's how you win. Others shared their own stories under the hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack, amplifying the movement into something larger than a single flight. Meanwhile, Claudia Monroe's name trended for very different reasons. Old complaints surfaced, screenshots of past reviews, even accounts from passengers who remembered her dismissive tone years before. Some defended her, calling the reaction excessive, but their voices were drowned by the tidal wave of outrage. Captain Jonathan Reed fared little better. Former crew members spoke anonymously to reporters, confirming patterns of silence and dismissal. "We tried to report things." One wrote, "Reed always brushed it off." Another added, "He protected her." Everyone knew it. The airline scrambled. Press releases rolled out hourly apologies, promises of reform, acknowledgement of systemic shortcomings. Richard Halloran appeared on live television, visibly shaken, admitting the failures. "We cannot undo what happened to Mr. Ellington," he said, "but we can ensure no passenger experiences it again." Through it all, Marcus remained steady. He gave interviews, but never grandstanding. His words were always precise, always aimed beyond personal injury to the larger issue. "This isn't about me," he repeated. "It's about the thousands whose complaints never made headlines." Dana watched one of the interviews from their living room, her hand resting gently over her chest. "You're giving them hope," she said softly when Marcus returned home that evening. "But you're carrying a heavy load." Marcus looked at her, his shoulders weary, but his gaze unwavering. If carrying it helps lighten theirs, then it's worth it. As night fell, Marcus stood by his study window, the city glowing below. His phone buzzed with another message request from senators for testimony, civil rights groups asking for partnership, journalists seeking exclusive coverage. The story had grown beyond him, beyond the bread, beyond the flight. He thought of his father, of the lessons carved in quiet resilience. He thought of his daughter, of the future she would inherit. He thought of every passenger who had ever felt invisible at 30,000 feet. The storm was not just in the media. It was in the hearts of people who had finally found a mirror for their pain. And Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of reaction. Airports across the country became stages for quiet protest. Travelers held up signs scrawled with sharp messages. Dignity at 30,000 feet. Bread is not enough. We deserve more than silence. In some terminals, passengers passed out slices of bread wrapped in napkins. A mocking symbol turned into a rallying cry. Marcus Ellington watched clips of these gatherings from his office, the screen glowing with images of strangers united by a single story. A young woman in Atlanta, holding a sign that read, "My father was given water when others got wine," her voice breaking as she described her humiliation. A family in Los Angeles, recounting how they had been forced to move seats after being mistaken for economy passengers despite their first-class tickets. Each story added fuel to the fire. But the backlash was not only against the airline. It targeted Claudia Monroe directly. Her name and photo were plastered across headlines, her social media accounts overwhelmed with anger. Some messages crossed the line into cruelty. Threats appeared, and the airline issued a statement condemning harassment. Marcus felt the weight of it. In his study, he told Dana, "I never wanted her destroyed. I wanted the system exposed. But the public doesn't separate easily." Dana rested her hand on his arm. "You can't control the storm once it leaves your hands, but you can shape where it goes." He nodded, her words grounding him. Meanwhile, support for Marcus poured in. Letters arrived from strangers, some handwritten, some emailed. Veterans, students, parents, all saying the same thing. Thank you for speaking up. Thank you for staying calm. Thank you for making them see us. One letter struck him deeply from a retired flight attendant who confessed that she had spent years watching bias play out silently in the aisles. "We were told to smile and move on." She wrote, "You showed that silence doesn't have to be forever." Corporate America took notice, too. Other airlines issued preemptive statements, promising to review their policies. One competitor even announced a new Equity in the Skies initiative, clearly scrambling to avoid being the next target of public outrage. Civil rights organizations reached out, asking Marcus to partner on long-term reforms. But with support came criticism. Some pundits accused him of using his wealth and power to make an example of ordinary workers. "He's a billionaire playing hero." One commentator sneered on cable news. What about the overworked staff just trying to survive? Marcus listened to these critiques with patience. In a live interview, he addressed them directly. This isn't about punishing people for being tired. This is about holding accountable those who weaponize their authority against passengers. Exhaustion doesn't excuse humiliation. Silence doesn't erase pain. The clip went viral, praised for its clarity. Yet Marcus knew the battle was no longer about sound bites. It was about direction. Would this storm fade, like so many others? Or would it etch lasting change into the structure of air travel inside Orion Airlines? Pressure mounted. Richard Halloran faced shareholders demanding answers. At an emergency meeting, one investor snapped, "We're hemorrhaging reputation. Fix it or step aside." Halloran, weary but resolute, announced sweeping reforms, independent equity boards, mandatory bias audits, new transparency measures, all overseen by Marcus as an external advisor. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Unions pushed back, fearing witch hunts. Some employees complained that they were being scapegoated for systemic issues created by management. The tension spread through internal forums, leaked to the press, fueling debates about fairness and reform. Marcus saw it all unfolding, the messy birth of change. He reminded himself of his father's words, "Justice feeds the future." He knew this was no clean victory, It was a struggle that would wound before it healed. One evening, as he prepared for yet another interview, Maya climbed onto his lap. "Daddy," she asked softly, "are people mad at you?" Marcus wrapped his arms around her. "Some are," he admitted, "but more are listening. And sometimes, when people listen, they get mad first, before they understand." She leaned her head on his chest. "I'm glad you didn't yell back on the plane," she whispered. "I like that you made them see instead." Her words settled into him like an anchor. This was the heart of it, not the headlines, not the hashtags, but the quiet hope that his daughter could believe in dignity, even when the world tried to strip it away. That night, Marcus stood at his window again, the city alive with lights. He thought of Claudia, alone somewhere in the storm of outrage. He thought of Reed, stripped of command. He thought of Lars, perhaps rehearsing his statement for investigators, his young conscience pushing him forward. Change was messy, but it was moving. The first crack from inside the airline didn't come from executives or shareholders. It came from Lars Whitman. The young attendant had spent nights pacing in his small apartment, replaying the flight over and over. He remembered Claudia Monroe's sneer, the smirk on the man across the aisle, the heavy silence pressing down on the cabin like turbulence that never ended. He remembered Marcus Ellington's calm, the untouched bread sitting like an indictment no one dared acknowledge. And most of all, he remembered the moment he whispered, "I'm sorry," and Marcus had answered with only 4 words, "Do what's right." Those words clung to him like a lifeline. So when investigators from the Independent Equity Board reached out, Lars didn't hesitate. He sat in the sterile interview room, hands trembling slightly as he recounted every detail, the tones of Claudia's voice, the way Reed dismissed complaints, the atmosphere that made silence easier than truth. He told them how complaints were whispered about among attendants but never written down, how crews learned to keep their heads down, to protect their shifts. His testimony cracked open the unspoken rules of survival inside the airline. The board members listened intently, recording every word. One leaned forward, asking softly, "Why speak now?" Lars swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Because I saw a man stay calm when he had every right to explode. And if he could carry that weight with dignity, the least I can do is tell the truth." Word of Lars's testimony leaked to the press within days. Headline shifted. Young attendant confirms airline culture of silence. Clips of his nervous but resolute voice spread online. Some praised him as courageous. Others criticized him as opportunistic. But for Marcus, watching the footage late one night, it was something else entirely. It was hope. Dana found him sitting in the living room, laptop open, Lars's testimony playing on loop. "He's just a kid," Marcus murmured, more to himself than to her. But he did it. He chose truth over silence. Dana touched his shoulder gently, "Because you gave him permission to believe it mattered." Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. He hadn't thought of it that way. He hadn't realized how his silence on the plane had spoken louder than any outburst. But now, seeing Lars step forward, he understood. The ripple had become a wave. Inside Orion Airlines, Lars's testimony sent shockwaves. Crew forums buzzed with debate. Some attendants privately thanked him, saying they'd endured similar situations. Others resented him, fearing his words would make passengers distrust them all. Managers grumbled about betrayal, but the silence had been pierced, and it could not be resealed. Richard Halloran called Marcus late that evening. "We're getting more reports," the CEO admitted, his voice weary. Lars's testimony opened the floodgates. Attendants are sending in statements. Some confirm what he said. Some add more. The culture of silence. It's worse than we thought. Marcus listened quietly, then replied, "This is what change looks like. It's uncomfortable. It's messy. But it's necessary." Halloran sighed. "You sound calm about it. I'm losing sleep. I've been losing sleep over this my entire life," Marcus said softly. "Now the world is finally catching up." The following week, Lars requested to meet Marcus in person. They sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, the hum of conversation around them providing cover. Lars looked nervous, his hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee. "I wanted to thank you," Lars began, for not making me feel small on that flight. I was scared. I still am. But I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Marcus studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You were scared, but you still spoke. That's courage. Lars, don't ever underestimate that." Lars's eyes shone. Relief mingled with resolve. "They might fire me," he admitted. "People say I'm a traitor." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "They can fire you from a job. They can't erase the truth, and truth has a way of finding work for those who carry it." The younger man nodded slowly, as though the words steadied him. As they left the cafe, Marcus felt a rare flicker of something he had long guarded against: optimism. If one young attendant could break the silence, others could too. And perhaps, just perhaps, the system could be rebuilt not just by pressure from above, but by courage from within. That night, back in his study, Marcus wrote in his notebook a habit he had kept since his teenage years. His pen moved steadily across the page. Justice isn't only what we demand. It's what we inspire others to believe in. Bread was the insult. Truth is the meal. He closed the book, set it aside, and looked out at the city lights. The storm was still raging, but now he could see sparks of light breaking through. Weeks passed, and what had begun as a single insult at 30,000 feet transformed into a national reckoning. Airports became places not only of travel, but of conversation. Posters quoting Marcus Ellington's interviews were taped to waiting area walls. Silence can be strategy. Justice is design. Passengers read them as they boarded flights, some nodding, some skeptical, but no one indifferent. Inside Orion Airlines headquarters, reforms were moving faster than anyone had predicted. The Independent Equity Board met weekly, reviewing dozens of complaints that had once been buried. Captains and attendants now knew their actions were no longer shielded by silence. Some bristled, others welcomed it, but the shift was undeniable. Marcus attended meeting after meeting, his calm presence shaping the process. He never raised his voice, but when he spoke, the room stilled. "You cannot fix culture with slogans," he reminded the executives. "You fix it with accountability that outlasts memory. A scandal fades, but systems remain. Build systems that protect dignity, not arrogance." Shareholders demanded updates. Halloran, once weary and hesitant, now carried Marcus's language into investor calls. "We are not managing a crisis," he said. "We are rewriting our foundation." His tone, though still strained, carried a conviction that had been absent weeks earlier. Not everyone accepted change easily. Unions filed grievances, arguing that constant monitoring through AeroWatch created paranoia. Some employees whispered about Marcus as though he were an overseer rather than an ally. Online debates raged. Is this accountability or surveillance? Marcus addressed the concerns directly in a town hall streamed to employees. "A tool can be a weapon or a shield," he said, standing at the podium. voice steady. Aerowatch was built as a shield for passengers and crew alike. If you serve with fairness, it protects you. If you use authority to harm, it exposes you. Fear comes not from the tool, but from how you choose to act beneath it. The recording spread internally, softening resistance. Slowly, employees began to test the system's fairness. When a young Latina attendant reported being harassed by a frequent flyer, her complaint was reviewed within 48 hours. Action taken swiftly. Word spread. The shield worked both ways. Beyond the airline, politicians took notice. Senators invited Marcus to testify before a committee on transportation equity. He stood before the chamber in Washington, lights glaring, cameras rolling, and spoke plainly. The sky does not erase bias. 30,000 feet is not high enough to rise above prejudice. If we want our skies to represent dignity, then we must design them for equity. His words echoed beyond the chamber, replayed across networks, quoted in op-eds. Civil rights leaders praised him. Critics continued to question his wealth and power, some calling him opportunistic. But Marcus remained steady, never taking the bait. This was never about me, he repeated. It was about the passengers who never had a platform. At home, Maya watched him on television, her small hand gripping Dana's. "Daddy looks like he belongs there," she whispered. Dana smiled, though her eyes glistened. "He belongs wherever justice needs him," she said softly. Yet for all the progress, Marcus carried the weight of unintended consequences. Claudia Monroe's life had unraveled. Stripped of her job, vilified online, she had vanished from public view. Marcus thought of her sometimes, not with glee, but with a quiet sorrow. He hadn't wanted her destroyed, he had wanted her accountable. But in the storm of public outrage, accountability often turned into annihilation. Late one evening, he admitted this to Dana. "I wanted change, not vengeance," he said quietly, staring at the city lights. "But sometimes the crowd doesn't know the difference." Dana touched his hand gently. "You can't control what people do with the truth. You can only choose how you carry it." Her words settled into him, heavy but steadying. The greatest surprise came not from executives or politicians, but from passengers. Thousands sent letters, not just of thanks, but of stories. Stories of quiet humiliations on flights, of being overlooked, of being dismissed. Marcus read them one by one, sometimes late into the night. Each letter a reminder that what he had endured was not isolated. It was systemic, vast, and deeply human. One letter came from a man in Detroit who had been escorted off a flight after being accused of suspicious behavior for requesting a second blanket. Another from a grandmother in Houston who had been told she didn't look like a first-class passenger. Each story cut into Marcus, but each also steeled him. These were the people Aerowatch had to protect, the ones who didn't have his platform or his power. In the following months, reforms rolled out. Anonymous flight evaluations given to every passenger, reviewed weekly by independent boards, transparent complaint processes with guaranteed response times, mandatory bias accountability embedded in training and performance reviews, whistleblower protections for employees who reported discrimination or misconduct. Some called it revolutionary, others called it excessive. But for Marcus, it was simple. Dignity, he said in one interview, is not an upgrade. It is the baseline. As spring settled over the city, Marcus sat again at his study desk, his notebook open. He wrote slowly, his pen carving the thought into permanence. Reform is not revenge. It is repair. And repair takes longer than rage, but it endures. He set the pen down, exhaled, and looked out the window at the city alive with light. The skies above were quiet tonight. But he knew they carried a new kind of weight now, the weight of passengers who believed, even cautiously, that they might be treated as equals. Marcus Ellington had not set out to become a symbol. He had set out to eat a meal in peace. But symbols are rarely chosen. They are born in silence, in insult, in bread left untouched. And from that bread, reform had begun. The storm had quieted, but its echoes lingered. Months after the incident on Flight UA-1208, the world had shifted in ways Marcus Ellington could feel in the air itself. Airports were different now. Passengers looked attendants in the eye more often. Attendants hesitated less when treating passengers equitably. Conversations about fairness in the skies had spread into broader conversations about dignity everywhere. One evening, Marcus walked through JFK's Terminal 4 unnoticed among the bustle. He moved slowly, taking in the atmosphere. Screens displayed Orion Airlines' new campaign. Every seat, every face, every voice. He saw attendants greeting passengers with practiced warmth. But this time there was something else: awareness. He knew culture didn't change overnight, but he could sense the difference. The silence that once pressed down like a weight had begun to lift. At the gate for a delayed flight, he overheard a passenger grumble about the wait. The attendant, young and nervous, responded calmly, "I understand your frustration. We'll take care of you." Simple words, but Marcus smiled faintly. Respect was not grandeur. It was small moments, multiplied. Later that week, Marcus stood on a stage at a packed conference hall in Washington. He had been invited to give a keynote on equity in corporate culture. Leaders, activists, students, journalists. They filled the seats, their eyes fixed on him. He began not with statistics or headlines, but with a story. "My mother once held my hand in a diner in Alabama," he said, his voice steady. "She told me that silence sometimes keeps you safe, but truth sets you free. On a flight months ago, I was handed bread when I had paid for a meal. The insult was not in the bread itself, but in what it represented: a system that decided some of us deserve less. That night, I chose silence not out of fear, but out of strategy. And that silence became louder than shouting. The audience was rapt." Marcus continued, his tone neither fiery nor soft, but deliberate, weighty. "Justice is not about punishing individuals into dust. Justice is about changing the design so that the insult cannot repeat itself. Reform is not revenge. It is repair." Applause rose, not thunderous, but resonant, the kind that carries thought as much as emotion. Marcus stepped back from the podium, allowing the words to linger in the room like a seed taking root. Outside the hall, reporters clustered, microphones extended. "Mr. Ellington, do you consider yourself an activist now?" one asked. Marcus paused. "No," he said simply. "I consider myself a man who asked for dinner and was handed truth instead." The activism came from everyone who said, "I felt that too." Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of the city, Lars Whitman was starting a new job, training new attendants under Orion's reformed program. His voice carried more steadiness now, his posture straighter. He told recruits about procedures, safety protocols, and then, in quieter moments, about dignity. "Passengers remember how you make them feel," he said. "And sometimes, speaking up is the most important service you'll ever give." His words bore the trace of Marcus's influence, passed on like a torch. Claudia Monroe, by contrast, remained absent from the public stage. A reporter tracked her down months later, living quietly in another state. She refused interviews, but in one fleeting comment she admitted, "I thought I was untouchable. I was wrong." The words never gained traction, buried under larger headlines, But Marcus read them once and felt no victory, only a faint sadness. People could change, but sometimes too late. At home, life settled into quieter rhythms. Dana noticed the weight in Marcus's shoulders had eased, even as his schedule remained full. Maya, now more curious than ever, often climbed into his lap with endless questions. "Daddy, do people still talk about the bread?" she asked one evening. Marcus chuckled softly. "Yes, they do. Do you like that she pressed?" He thought for a long moment, then answered honestly, "I like that they don't just talk about the bread. They talk about fairness, about respect, about change. If bread was the beginning, then I can live with that." Maya smiled, satisfied with the answer. "I think you made the skies better," she whispered, before drifting off to sleep in his arms. Marcus sat in the quiet of the evening, the city lights flickering outside. He opened his notebook again. Pen poised, he wrote slowly, deliberately. Legacy is not built in headlines. It is built in small choices repeated by mothers in diners, by fathers in silence, by children who ask why, by attendants who finally speak. Justice is not a meal served once. It is a table kept ready for everyone, every day. He set the pen down, closed the notebook, and allowed himself to breathe. The storm had changed him, but it had also changed the skies. And in that change, he found not triumph, but something deeper, healing. Life often reminds us that dignity is not something money can buy. It is something society must choose to honor. This story of Marcus Ellington shows us a deeper truth: prejudice does not disappear at 30,000 feet. It hides in the smallest actions: a dismissive look, a piece of bread handed where respect was owed. Yet the lesson is not only about injustice, it is about how we respond to it. Marcus chose not to explode in anger, though he had every reason to. Instead, he carried himself with calm, exposing not just a person's cruelty, but an entire system's failure. His restraint teaches us that silence, when used with wisdom, can be more powerful than shouting. And his reforms show us that justice is not revenge, it is repair. For those of us who have lived long enough to know the sting of being dismissed, his story is a reminder it is never too late to demand fairness. And it is never too late to build systems that treat every face with equal worth. Dignity is not an upgrade, it is a birthright. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like this matter because they remind us that respect and justice belong to everyone. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories to light.